2 days ago, we had a conversation on Kashmir, on what's happening in Kashmir, what's happened in Kashmir over the last 1 year, and what the plight of the people in Kashmir really is. And it got me thinking about the fact that almost all conversation we have about Kashmir these days is adversarial. You have television channels that are shouting and yelling and calling people names, and it's all about one side hating the other side. In all of this, there's the story of the Kashmiri Pandits, a group of people whose plight or whose needs have been used as part of a larger conversation, has been used as part of reasons for what is happening. A lot of the argument has been that 370, the abrogation of 370 had to happen so that the Kashmiri Pandits could go back to their homes that they lost in the early 90s. And it's been a year, but that hasn't happened. And I wonder why no one's having a calm conversation with members of the Kashmiri Pandit community as to what they want, how they feel about all of what is happening right now. And I realized we have a YouTube channel. We can be the people who have that conversation. So I then spent some time trying to figure out who's the best person to have that conversation with. And we zeroed in on the name of Professor Amitabh Mattoo. And he was kind enough to agree to speak to us today. But first, I must introduce him to those of our audience members who don't know his very illustrious professional career. Now, he was the advisor to the Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir with a cabinet minister position. He was the chair to the Jammu and Kashmir Knowledge Initiative, which was meant really to encourage education and to encourage ambition for young people in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. He's a professor at the JNU University, honorary professor at the University of Melbourne, Padma Shri awardee, and he has a list of professional accomplishments, academic qualifications, awards, and books that run into 2.5 A4 size sheets of paper. So I don't have enough time to read it all, but if you're more interested in all of those things, please look him up. And I'm really pleased to invite to this conversation Professor Amitabh Mattoo. Professor Mattoo, good evening. And thank you for making time for us.
Thank you, Faye. I'm a great admirer of your work. And I wish your YouTube channel and all its attendant activities all the very best. I mean, you're just the kind of independent journalist that we need in India. And you're just a person to be able to engage with a cool and composed conversation. And I'm delighted and honored to be here.
Thank you so much for agreeing, and I'm really happy. For our audience, this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about Kashmir, the Kashmiri Pandits, what they need at this point, and what should be done really to achieve those goals. We will also answer questions that you might have during the course of the conversation. Professor Mattoo, my first question to you is a slightly personal one. You just wrote an article for The Hindu. And in that article, you pointed out that, that you believe that the government has not really managed to bridge the gap between Delhi and the hearts and minds of people of Kashmir. And you said it's a long, long way to go before that happens. When you look at the situation as it is right now, 1 year after the abrogation of 370, and the Jammu and Kashmir that you were advising, what's your opinion of what has happened so far and what has been achieved?
I think what you had quite clearly has been a constitutional integration of Jammu and Kashmir. And to really answer directly and briefly without much nuance, and the answer to your question is that there hasn't been an emotional integration. And ultimately, the real test of that constitutional integration will be the people of Jammu and Kashmir. When there is that emotional integration, then there will be ownership for what happened in 5th of August last year. I think that's the uphill task. And frankly, over the next 12 months, that's what the government should be aiming to do. And in some ways, those 12 months, the 12 months that we see now, are probably going to be as consequential as the last 12 months.
But if I may just take you back a little bit when we talk about the Kashmiri Pandits, again, a lot of the arguments, the sort of WhatsAppish arguments that were made when 370 was removed is, but this is what the Kashmiri Pandits needed. Do you believe this is what was needed?
Let me, instead of answering your question directly, add some nuance there, because it's not a question that can be easily addressed. First of all, I think you need to recognize that the Kashmiri Pandit community is in some ways exceptional. Of course, I mean, every community is exceptional in that sense. But here was a microscopic minority, at best, counting the global diaspora, never more than 1 million people, and probably about just 500,000 who were there in the valley, 100% educated, liberal to the core, religiously liberal, I mean, adapting, accommodating, synthesizing, including their own Kashmiri Shaivite philosophy with Sufi tradition, completely non-violent. Never in the history of Jammu and Kashmir and Kashmiri Pandits have you found a militant group or an aggressive group, even to these years of displacement and tragic displacement. There's never been any attempt by any Kashmiri Pandit to try and use violence as a form of protest or to secure the demands. So it's an atypical community. This formed the backbone of the intelligentsia within the valley, where they were a minority within a minority. In some ways, the only comparison that you can think of as communities do, and like all comparisons, this is going to be challenged by so many others, it's like the Parsis, as small, as well-educated, and professionally almost as successful as the Parsis are today. So that's the kind of community that we are talking about. But remember, the 370 itself was never an impediment to Kashmiri Pandits buying property or domicile rights, because Kashmiri Pandits could still, as legitimate state subjects, buy property. But obviously, the conditions for the return were not such where most Kashmiri Pandits wanted to go back, because the gulf between the Pandits and the Muslims was only widening rather than being bridged during these years. And it's that gulf that is a source of great tragedy. In some ways, that gulf has hurt the Kashmiri Muslims as much, if not more, than the Pandits. They've lived without the diversity of the Pandits. They've lived without the sense of a buffer of a minority can provide. And ultimately, a majoritarian question could be, here is a community which didn't even offer the protection and rights to its own minority and is demanding special rights within the larger union. It's a legitimate question, because for all the conspiracy theories that you might hatch, it was Jagmohan who provided the trucks and the logistics, and it was the responsibility of the state. Ultimately, if there was someone far-sighted enough within the Pandits, but more so within the Muslims, they would have realized that the displacement of the Pandits from the valley was going to be not just a great tragedy, but was going to hurt everyone.
Well, on that point, Professor, Mr. Farooq Abdullah has, in fact, just 3 days ago called for an investigation again into what is being called the exodus. But I like the word you are using, displacement, far better, because an exodus would mean voluntary. This was not voluntary. This was an entire community that was asked to pack up and leave almost overnight, and they left all their belongings and their home behind. Do you believe that an investigation into that matter is what is needed at this point?
Look, I mean, you have to look at the history of how these things have been resolved. There are always bodies like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions being adopted, most notably in South Africa, to see what crimes were committed during the years of apartheid, and to try and build back that kind of bonding, which, if it did ever exist, between the whites and the Afrikaners and Black Africans. But what you need to do is go back if you want to, but then there has to be an acceptance that there were a number of people who may have aided and abetted with the displacement of the Kashmiri Pandits, but it's time to move beyond. You cannot, in some ways, the past, acceptance of the past, even apologizing for the past, is not always a recipe or a remedy for the future. I think it's still important for Pandits and Muslims to come together. I am, of course, one of those voices of moderation which has been calling for that over all these years and being really targeted by both sides. From the Muslim side as an instrument of the Indian state, from a section of the Pandits seeing as really representing a voice of the Muslims. But ultimately, I see the future of Jammu and Kashmir beyond the constitutional arrangements, etc., is when only peaceful future is when Pandits and Muslims can live together, cohabit together in the kind of diversity and in the kind of space that they inhabited before 1990.
Is it possible, Professor, for the Pandits to go back? What would they need? Do they need protection from state government or central government? Would they ever get their homes back, the homes that they were forced to leave? Would they ever get those property rights back?
See, there are three kinds of Pandits, if you can, again, broad categories subject to all sorts of caveats. First, Pandits are who didn't leave for a variety of reasons. Some people were far too poor and impoverished and didn't have the means to leave. And so there are others who had the means to avoid or to firewall themselves against any problems. They were part of that microscopic elite. No matter what happens, they're privileged enough to secure for themselves the kind of privileged life that they led before the problems began. So those are the two categories of the Pandits which were stayed back: the really marginal and the truly elite. The second is the people who are a group of Kashmiri Pandits who continue to live in the camps in Jammu, and they are still leading terrible existences. And they probably, empowered, would go back. Then there is the larger Kashmiri Pandit diaspora internationally, who might want to come back for reasons of pilgrimage, who might want to have property, but will never come back and settle down in Kashmir. It's like my family, my daughters, much so I may want them to come back and experience the kind of glories of Kashmir as you do every summer with your family. I think that will remain a dream. They may come back, perhaps but never really be able to enjoy the kind of life, that idyllic life that I did growing up in Kashmir, because the tragedy of Kashmir was that it was different, that you grew up not recognizing the differences with the Muslims, not in the kind of stark manner as the rest of India experienced. There wasn't acts of violence during partition. Gandhi saw the only beacon of light in Kashmir. This is what made Kashmir special. The synthesis between Shaivism and Sufism, where you went to each other's shrines, where you lived together, even if you lived separately, even if you didn't interdine often, even if you didn't marry in each other's communities, but there was a certain harmony in terms of the society, in harmony with nature.
Professor, your family was in Srinagar when the displacement happened during 89 and 90. Were you also there? What can you tell us about what happened then?
I wasn't there. I was studying in England, but my parents were there. My father was a civil servant. My mother is a teacher. And why did they not leave? Let me tell you that my mother was in Delhi for that winter period in November, December, because the colleges had closed down. But my father was right there. And I must say that what he reported was frightening. There were loud slogans being shouted from the mosques. There were posters being put up by newspapers, as well as other posters by militant organizations asking the Pandits to leave within a certain period of time. But why did they stay back? Because my father and my mother and our family belonged to that elite, had tremendously cordial relations in our neighborhood. So there wasn't any sense of insecurity. We had no security in terms of police security, but there wasn't any sense of being besieged. And, and perhaps also because we had such large property interests in the valley that we didn't want we didn't want to leave that behind. So I think a variety and combination of circumstances, not being wanting to leave behind all this, not really having a house anywhere else of the same kind that you did in Srinagar, being protected by your own neighborhood. But it was not that the average Kashmiri Pandit, or indeed maybe even the Muslim, didn't feel deeply insecure during those days. There was anarchy on the streets of Srinagar. Anyone who claims to the contrary is either not experienced that or wants to deny the truth. The state was not in existence. The Jagmohan had just taken over, Farooq Abdullah had resigned. So it's very difficult on those circumstances if someone says, hey, why don't you just go to Jammu and you will, at least temporarily, at least your life will be protected. That is an option that lots of people exercise. But no one leaves, and I have done this after having initially blamed the Pandits, but after 30 years, frankly, I've realized age and experience does teach you all these things, is that you don't leave your home out of choice. You don't leave a lifestyle, your roots, if you have an option. You leave it usually when you're really, truly feeling extremely exercised about their existence. And the tragedy was that the Pandits, the only people who actually owned them up, were not the liberals like me outside the Pandits, because they saw the larger Kashmiri problem through the lenses and the prism of the Muslims and the fight, their fight for their own rights. And the liberals obviously identified with that minority, which they saw as part of a larger marginalized minority within the rest of India. The Pandits are forgotten people. And the only person who recognized them paradoxically was Bal Thackeray, who recognized that what they wanted more was not concessions, but just access to education. And he provided them seats in colleges in Mumbai and elsewhere in Maharashtra through his good offices, with the result that the Pandits today have done exceptionally well. Everyone who came out is much more empowered, doing much better than they were before in the 90s. And have become, consequentially, a very powerful voice, whether it's in the United States or within India itself.
A lot of, like I had pointed out a little earlier, a lot of the conversation that's happening in the country right now is using the story of the Kashmiri Pandits as reasons for the actions being taken by government. Bharat Rawal, also one of our viewers, asks a similar question. He says, given the amount of polarization right now between the Hindus and the Muslims, is there a opportunity, do you think, at all for peace between the Kashmiri Pandits and the Kashmiri Muslims? Or has the conversation just gone beyond that possibility?
I mean, has the conversation gone beyond redemption? Is the gulfs too wide now that no bridge can be built? I actually believe that you reached the nadir. You reached this abyss. And it's from this abyss that there is going to be recognition of the need to reconcile. I have seen within a critical mass of the Pandits and within the Muslims, even those who had really hardline positions, recognize that bridge, that bond, served both communities better. In fact, as I said, it was a force. And when you talked about advising the chief minister, Mufti Sayeed actually, and this is a digression, invited a section of the Kashmiri Pandits leadership from within the RSS for over lunch in Delhi. amongst his first engagements when he became chief minister. And you know what he began by telling them? He said, look, you don't need us. You as in the Pandits, we as in the Muslims, you don't need us. You've done exceptionally well wherever you've gone. But without you, we are deprived of that diversity. You were the only ones who were contributing to our diversity, and a monochromatic culture can never really flourish. That diversity is important to introduce moderation. It's important to introduce a certain sense of sensitivity to other cultures. So there was that recognition. So I see, even at this time when everyone seems to think of only the black clouds, I see the silver lining. I see the silver lining in the fact that you and I are having this conversation coolly and in a very composed fashion, even though you're in a new avatar and I don't know where I'll be, whether I'll be in Melbourne or I'll be in Mysore.
That could just be because we're cool people, Professor. We haven't involved any of the hotheads in this conversation.
Yeah, but for the cool to retain their coolness when everyone else is raising the temperature is a mark that there's still space for us, despite it all.
There has been one point of view that's been written about quite a bit, and you mentioned it a little bit in your first answer, where you said that for a state that didn't look after its own minority to be asked and to be asking for that special treatment seemed a little rich. There's been to take that a little further, with your permission, there's been one theory that the Kashmiri Muslims are now facing the kind of treatment that was actually meted out to the Kashmiri Pandits back in the 90s, where they were isolated, they were made to feel that they don't belong, they were made to feel that they're not needed. A could be taken as retribution, B could be taken as a further recipe for disaster. If you believe that was the beginning of bad times, do you believe that some portion of this can be restored, should be restored to?
Let me, in a sense, slightly grandiosely and pompously pose a couple of questions. One, to the Muslims, is there a recognition that if the Pandits hadn't left, and this should be not an emotional reaction, but an honest clinical reaction, that the Pandits' presence in the valley provided a buffer against extremism of various kinds? And to Pandits, really, can you imagine going back to Kashmir without reconciling with the Muslims? Ultimately, the Pandits today can only gain, other than schadenfreude from the misery of the Muslims, can only gain if there's some degree of reconciliation with the Muslims. And the Muslims have to recognize that Pandits are not just informers of the Indian state, that they today have greater agency in many ways.
Yes.
To plead their own cause for a more stable governance, stable, sensitive, democratic society, then they would be able to. Ultimately, you are faced with the might of the Indian state. You can imagine futures that we are, as you know, ultimately have a government, the strongest government possible since Indira Gandhi, if not stronger. And while we'll retain our coolness and our composure, but we have to clinically measure up to the fact that you can't, it's not easy for you to confront the state unless you find a way, modus vivendi, which should accommodate the larger interests.
You also, in a recent article, you talked about how you believe that statehood ought to be restored. Do you believe that the government's steps to turn Jammu and Kashmir into a union territory was not wise?
I think it's demeaning for a state to be turned into a union territory. It's demeaning that you do it to a state which had a special status. and and that there is no precedent of this having happened in the past. And more important, I think the fact that the Prime Minister and the Home Minister have held up this carrot that once the situation is right, statehood will be restored. I think it should be done. I think it should be done in a manner in which people feel empowered. And I think Jammu and Kashmir, certainly, Leh primarily and Kargil to a certain extent seem to be liking the idea of being a union territory on their own. But Jammu and Kashmir to become a state again, I think is imperative for it to be able to have the kind of agency that's necessary with the kind of diversity of people living in the state. But to answer the question that you raised was in some ways in the name of Pandits. Yes, the fact that you have a government which wants to defend the interests of a Hindu majority, it does serve its interests to have not just its interests, but it is in some ways, it serves, there is a constituency which says, look, here are 3 million people living in exile for all these years. Or not 3 million, sorry, 300,000 or 400,000, 500,000 people living in exile outside the state. How can you allow that? And as I said, because the liberals refused to accept the Pandits as part of the list of people who had grievances, many of the Pandits identified with the right wing. Although, as I said, when I was as liberal, as accommodative as the most tolerant minority anywhere. And exceptionally gifted, if I may say so.
But I'd agree with you. Professor, you did talk about reconciliation. You said reconciliation is important if the Pandit community were to go back. If at all that's a possibility, it's going to happen on reconciliation more than anything else. What would that reconciliation look like? I mean, do we need people to start, shaking hands across the street? What would something like this look like?
I mean, I think in these COVID times, reconciliation would mean a certain physical distance, but much greater emotional intensity of engagement. But more importantly, I think there was a neat kind of balance in terms of interdependence that existed. The Kashmiri Pandits were the educationists, the teachers, the people who excelled in the fields of literature. And most Kashmiri Muslims, even you ask now, of that generation will remember Pandits as those great leaders and great teachers. So I think gradually what's happening is that while the Muslims themselves have entered into education, but this is an area, and given that Kashmir was always known for its knowledge, known for its universities, including Sharada Peeth, which is now in POK, but you set up a university which can form the germ, the seed of a process of reconciliation where Kashmiri students and Muslim students and Pandit students taught by Pandits and Muslims can live, work, cohabit together, perhaps create a knowledge city where there will also be the space then to move out and work together. It's through those, in some ways, manufactured experiments rather than an organically driven process, because organically driven processes require much more nurturing and care, and ultimately, and sometimes there are circumstances outside your control, the weather, the monsoons, etc. But a more laboratory-driven experiment like setting up a university in a campus could then also have a huge multiplier impact on the society around you. So I'm really saying begin small at a time when Schumacher seems even more relevant than he was when he talked about small being beautiful. I think it's time to begin small and then see how it flowers.
Do you and I know that you were deeply invested, and you're deeply invested with education within the state as well. The lockdown of the last 1 year, because Kashmir has actually been in lockdown now for an entire year, COVID plus other reasons. What impact has that had on education as a sector for students both in school and college?
Yeah, look, you and I are having this conversation online, and I think in some ways we now, at least over the period of the last 6 months, we've developed a fair degree of proficiency in how we can manage these conversations almost as well as we would do in person. You need to be close to a router, and you need to have a good internet connection. And but there is also a certain less kind of number of props that you require to have a conversation like this. But having said that, there's nothing to replace face-to-face contact and actual campus campus teaching, especially when the broadband is not available and still 2G for security reasons. So that suffered tremendously. The whole world has suffered. So it's probably exceptional because of the low bandwidth of internet connectivity, but this pandemic is unprecedented. But let me say counterintuitively, and it's really counterintuitively, there are lots and lots of people who just begun reading books again. Now you might think that's not such a great idea. Books are passé, but I'm an old-fashioned teacher who still values a library and still has a library in Srinagar. So I think people have access to books. I know people have written books during this period, and you can buy them off Amazon if you're on a Kindle version. So that's happened. So there are goods and bads. I would, as I said, with like everything else, I just don't like the idea of giving answers which are intuitively obvious. I was taught that you have to be counterintuitive. That's my kind of Kashmiri Pandits dialectical training, which is question everything. Question the fact that people didn't get educated, because what you do get educated by even staying on your own and reading lots of books. I mean, as long as you can overcome whatever other mental health issues there might be for some people.
Do you believe it's important right now to restore the political system or the electoral political system in Kashmir as quickly as possible, to have those elections to bring, to bring that sense of ownership back to the citizens?
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, it's in the name of democracy and in the name of empowerment that 370 was able to advocate it. So at the very least, Jammu and Kashmir should experience all the rights and privileges that any Indian citizen can, including the ability to have conversations, dissent within reason without causing public order issues, and having the agency to be able to access public services and make the democratic system more accountable by electing people and defeating them at the hustings. Free, fair elections, restoration of statehood. Obviously, I think one issue that's come out and often been repeated is, if anything, the 370 just destroyed the mainstream. In some ways, the mainstream needs to introspect as well. How fragile was the mainstream that it hadn't built the kind of coalition that it should have with the rest of India or within Kashmir itself, that at its demise, there are so few people mourning it, in despite the COVID pandemic, which might limit the numbers of allowed to mourn. But even given those exceptional circumstances, why is it that it weren't able to build the coalitions with opposition parties in the rest of India? Surely it couldn't have happened with the same degree of ease had it happened in Orissa or Tamil Nadu or Bengal.
But Professor, you were advisor to a government that was an ally of the BJP. This was the Mufti BJP government. It seemed counterintuitive to a lot of people, but it happened. was it that alliance that fell apart that brought us to where we are today, where Miss Mufti is still in custody or still in home arrest?
I mean, it was her father, Mufti Muhammad Sayeed Sahab, who actually stitched up the alliance with the BJP, and there was an agenda for alliance, a document. In some ways, that was the beginning, in some ways, of an experiment at reconciliation. Because there were so many differences between Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu elected BJP with a huge majority. Kashmir elected most members from the PDP. So what Mufti wanted the reconciliation to begin through this agenda for alliance and slowly to percolate to the grassroots. He died early. I still think he had the masterly ability to navigate through the minefield of Indian politics, and that this alliance may have had a greater chance if he hadn't passed away within 1 year of him having first taken that plunge to form the alliance between what he said himself in interviews was like trying to bridge the North Pole with the South Pole. But if you're able to do that successfully through a virtual cartographic imagination, then you have a solution. When you can get the Muslims and the Pandits together, when you can get Jammu and Kashmiri sitting together, when you can have the people from Jammu and Srinagar talk to Delhi and arrive at a modus vivendi, that is the final process of reconciliation.
Do you believe, post the passing of former Chief Minister Mr. Mufti, and the alliance did fall apart, but it does seem as if one half of that alliance, the BJP, has a completely different point of view right now as to how to solve these problems. Do you think that the presence of one individual, and I know you've said that he was your guru and he was perhaps your last guru in Mr. Mufti, could he have changed that? Or would it have been an eventuality? Because it does seem like the current government's feelings are very strong.
Yeah, it's one of the questions you're asked to shy away from when you were taught history in undergraduate class is the counterfactual. What if Hitler hadn't existed? Would you still have had the Holocaust? What if Mrs. Gandhi hadn't been in power? Would you still have the emergency? You can never, ever create the laboratory conditions in which you can examine questions like that. Having said that, the very fact that you had BJP moderating its position, PDP reconciling to the fact of an alliance with the BJP. BJP, that document committed itself to a large number of issues which were contrary to its manifesto. There was no compulsion to do so. Why did they do it? Was it just a tactical, temporary move to buy time? I don't know. I mean, that's history will tell us. Or maybe once the archives are opened or once someone speaks to the principal interlocutors from the BJP side, perhaps Faye, you can do that in as cool as a composed manner as we've had this conversation today. But if the BJP entered into that alliance and you assume when you negotiate, ultimately anywhere at any time in the world, the basic principle of negotiations is you and I may disagree completely at the end of this conversation, but we'll conduct the conversation in good faith. So I'll not say something just to appeal to you. We're going to have this in-camera conversation. So we begin in good faith. So if they acted in good faith, agreed in good faith, then Mufti becomes an important variable in that equation. Remove the equation, it collapses. Remove the variable, it collapses.
Well, as a scholar who studied the history of the state and where we've come from and how we've gotten to this point, do you believe that the removal of Article 370 was necessary? It was something that needed to be done?
People have asked me that question, and that's the only question which I feel that answering that would perhaps position me in a certain political box where I would naturally identify with, but would leave less space for me to be more creative in terms of my efforts at reconciliation. So it's my academic past which haunts me but comes in the way of my future sense of agency. It's behind us. It's an academic question. We academics will write histories and books about whether it was necessary or not. But if someone tells me today that the Modi government, or even whenever there is an opposition government, it's going to go back to where we were, I would find it difficult to swallow. And remember, most of the changes to 370, the point that it had really lost much of its potency, it was really diluted and it didn't have much impact. Most of these constitutional amendments that had preceded the abrogation were done during Congress governments, most of them.
Yes.
With Ghulam Muhammad Sadiq and Bakshi and so on and so forth. So it was just that this was dramatic, event-based, announcement-based, and the BJP did it because they also said that this was a commitment given by them at the point by their first president, Shama Prasad Mukherjee.
So just to explain to our audience, for those who don't understand, who are still asking that question, 370 basically allowed for Kashmiri people, both Pandits and Muslims who have domicile, who are from the state, the ability to buy property, the ability to hold jobs and positions in that state, thereby protecting the the population of that state. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think you have to read 370 and 35A together. 370 mainly said that you can't have any law extended, law passed in India through the Parliament of India and ratified by the President of India, applicable to J&K unless its assembly decides to enforce that law. So the laws of India did not apply to Jammu and Kashmir unless Jammu and Kashmir agreed to that laws. Simultaneously, there was a permanent resident status given to domiciles of that state, and that allowed you to buy property and to gain access to government jobs. Now, 370, that the domicile is a provision which is not unique to Jammu and Kashmir. Many of the northeastern states, including Himachal Pradesh and other states, have it. It's a way of also guaranteeing land alienation, that land alienation doesn't take place. And often you people have movements for son of the soil. In Mumbai, I mean, Shiv Sena's one of the important demands was that, look, jobs should be reserved for the Marathi-speaking people at one stage. At least that might have changed, and Mumbai has always been much more cosmopolitan than the rest of us. But that was there were movements like this everywhere, and there were reservations elsewhere as well. But 370 just gave you the illusion of power that, okay, we'll not accept any law of Delhi unless we accept it on our own.
Well, I'm going to ask you a emotional question then, not to have you trapped in your in your history as an academic. If you were to imagine what you'd like to see Kashmir as in, say, 5, 10, 15 years, what would it look like?
In two short words, at peace with itself and the rest of the world, and with people living in prosperity defined in terms of human development. But if you were to flesh that out, then you'd say that a Kashmir which is environmentally much more conscious, which has best practices institutionalized in terms of tourism and all its other development activities, and has a sense of empowerment while ensuring that there is a diversity which is part of that original Kashmir that I knew, the Pandits and the Kashmiri Muslims living together in harmony, going to school together, an Irish Catholic school that you might identify or you might not identify with as much as I identify with, where we began together with the Lord's Prayer and no one, Sikh, Hindus, Muslims, had a word to say, even though there wasn't any Christian in our class. But that's the kind of thing, a sense of synergy, a sense of syncretism, which defined Kashmir. And that's what made Kashmir special for me and for my generation, who believed that ultimately we have to live together. We're all, um, and all these are man-made, woman,
Yes.
man-made fantasies of trying to create divisions and conflicts which none really exist.
Well, the only thing to say after that, Professor, is inshallah. Hopefully that will indeed happen.
And if I
And
can
we will
say
see.
amen.
Yes, indeed. Professor Mattoo, thank you so much for speaking with me. I do hope we can talk more often and have more conversations about the history of where we've come from and where it's likely we're headed from here. Professor Amitabh Mattoo spending time with us this evening on YouTube. Thank you for answering all of my questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Silva.